I wake to the steady beep of a monitor and a fluorescent glare that makes my eyelids feel like paper. My chest is a landscape of newness, a rawness under skin and tape, the dull ache where something was taken, and somewhere else it is doing its work. The last thing I remember before waking is the antiseptic sting of the pre-op room, the orderly nods, my own hand gripping the stainless steel rail, as if it would anchor me to the life I was about to leave behind, even for a little while. 3 days later, while I'm still on the slow whirl of painkillers and hospital food, my husband walks into that same room, not with flowers or the half-mumbled promises people make at bedsides. He walks in with a man in a suit who smells faintly of cologne and confidence, and a woman with her hand pressed to the curve at her belly, smiling like she owns the future. The man in the suit hands me a stack of papers. The woman glances at me with polite curiosity, the kind you give a stranger who's at once inconvenient and useful. They are divorce papers. I stare down at the words, dissolution of marriage, in cold official font, while my throat tightens around pain like a fist. Ryan speaks before I can. He says the words that are supposed to be administrative. He says them like they are tidy solutions, like a refund slip. We've already talked to a lawyer. This is better for everyone. He says it like I am making a choice now, as if he hadn't been absent from phone calls, as if he hadn't said nothing while I lay under anesthesia, hoping his face would be the first I saw when I opened my eyes. My phone buzzes on the bedside table. A message from Gloria, my mother-in-law, who 3 days ago I had watched float pale and hopeful on a gurney toward the same surgical wing. It reads, "Thank you. You were temporary. Enjoy your recovery. XO." There is a little heart emoji after the initials that feel like gravel in my mouth. There is a particular betrayal that instruments and sutures can't prepare you for. Not physical pain, not the way your body remembers every step down a set of stairs. This is the betrayal that moves like a slow leak, quiet until the room smells of betrayer. It smells like the paperwork they hand you instead of staying because you gave them part of yourself. Giving a kidney felt like an answer. Receiving divorce papers felt like evidence. If you want to hear how I fought back, hit like and keep watching. I have always been the practical kind. I am 32, an art teacher at the public high school 2 neighborhoods over. My hands are used to making things: clay cups, poster backs, bulletin boards, and repairs. I spend my days elbow deep in glaze and school glue, teaching 18-year-olds how to translate feeling into form. My students will tell you I have a laugh like a kettle, and that when I get excited, my hands talk faster than my mouth. At home, I did the budgets. I paid our bills, filed the taxes, balanced the joint account with a small spreadsheet that had more columns than romance. Ryan was late nights at sales meetings, at shows, chasing the next quota like a promise. He was persuasive and warm, the kind of man whose smile made other people feel fortunate. That ease is what made the early signs feel like disruptions at first. A vanishing savings cushion, small withdrawals with vague labels, late-night phones that he hid behind closed doors. He would reassure me when I asked, brush my worry away with an "I'll fix it, babe." We argued about money the way people argue about weather, brief storms that blow through. I believed him because he built a life that sounded believable, a job that had expenses and promises of future upsides. I believed him because I wanted to. Then Gloria called. She was 62, with the stubborn persistence of a woman who had raised 3 demanding sons and had never been taught how to stop for herself. Her voice on the other end was smaller than usual when she told me the diagnosis: kidneys failing. The word itself, failure, landed like a verdict. Ryan went silent in the background, a shape behind the phone. She needed a transplant, the doctor said. The family would be tested. They called us into the hospital for blood draws and a battery of tests. There is a strange intimacy to being measured in a fluorescent room. They take parts of you and put them on slides and look. The technicians are careful. The doctors are clinical in the way of people who survive by staying 2 steps away emotionally from what they do. I sat with my arm out, the cool of the tourniquet, and tried to imagine a life where a hospital corridor leads back to a kitchen that smells like coffee and the sound of a TV in the other room. When they told me I was a match, it felt like the only decent thing left to do. It felt like the answer to a prayer I didn't know I'd been making. I thought of Gloria's laugh when she watched Ryan as a child, the way she folded lasagna with a practiced hand at holiday dinners. I thought of the policy and the pamphlets and the consent forms with their tiny print that promised a thorough process. I thought about the students I would return to, the one who needed help finishing a portfolio, the quiet boy who painted birds to feel less alone. I wanted to go back to those rooms with fewer alarms. There was pressure, yes, and there was also a shape to that pressure that was hard to name. At family dinners, Ryan would put his hand over mine and say things that sounded like devotion and duty. Gloria would get teary. Her voice would lower as if she was telling a secret, and Ryan would tell me later how proud she was of me. At times it read like gratitude. At others it felt like a script I was expected to follow. They said things like, family does this for each other, and who else would do it? The appeals were never direct threats. They were a steady application of expectation and need. I called Dr. Helen Crawford at school, my principal, and the person I go to when the day feels too much. She had been a constant who spoke in precise sentences and brief hugs. She told me what I needed to hear. This is serious, Maya. Make sure you understand the health risks. Make sure your consent is informed. She reminded me of all the practical things no one mentions in those glossy donor brochures. Time off, how the body will recover, how pain can linger where the surgery was. Her voice was both a hand on my shoulder and a gentle jolt back to myself. The hospital did its job with clinical thoroughness. There were meetings with surgeons, with social workers, with a counselor who asked me about my support system. Each person took notes, asked for signatures, explained what a match meant in neutral anatomical language. They spoke of HLA typing, a set of genetic markers that helps a body recognize a donor organ as friend rather than foe. They told me my HLA profile matched Gloria's in a way that reduced the risk of rejection. They said the odds were good. They did not, and could not, predict what would happen in the weeks after giving a part of my body away. The morning of the operation, Ryan kissed my forehead quickly, an absent kiss, and promised the surgeon's assistant would call me afterward. I remember feeling a calmness that was almost religious, the sense that I was doing exactly what needed to be done. I signed forms, I said things that people say in pre-op rooms, I love yous into a ceiling tile. I held the hand of a nurse who hummed a radio song I half remembered as the lights narrowed around the edges of my vision. I remember the anesthesia like a heavy velvet drop, and then absence. Waking was an odd geography, pain in the incision like a reminder and not a confession. The machine's beeps were punctuation marks for oxygen and heart rate. I saw Ryan only in flashes, a peripheral man, sometimes present, sometimes gone. He hovered briefly, then excused himself as if to run an errand and never returned fully. The first night I was more alone than I had been in years. Guests he said would come, did not. Calls he said he would take, he did not. 3 days later, the divorce papers turned up on the bedside cart like an administrative afterthought. I remember the sound of Ryan's shoes against linoleum. I remember the way his voice pitched as if he was negotiating a sale. Efficient, practiced. The suit was expensive enough to say he had planned this presentation. The pregnant woman who would become Cassie, who I was later to learn was his girlfriend before the divorce was mentioned, smiled in a way that made me think of someone trying to prove they can be nice in the face of another person's loss. I could hold all the legal language and not catch the thing that burned under my skin. The times alone, the months of small vanishings, the way my generosity had been counted and cataloged like an asset. The message from Gloria crystallized it. Temporary. The word flung between us not as kindness, but as definition. There is a type of cruelty that hides in courtesy, and theirs was surgical. When I finally left the hospital, I could have stayed where the monitors hummed, but physiologically the team declared me well enough, and I had to face the fact that life outside would be harder. Still bandaged, still careful on stairs, I moved in with my sister, Tanya. She has a house with a narrow porch and too many plants, and an energy that makes bad coffee into something you sip like a benediction. She took me in without much debate, as if the word family for her carried the old, uncorrupted definition. You show up, and you don't tally the gifts. Those first weeks were a blur of recovery and realization. Physical healing demanded patience. My body learned to pick up slack where a kidney had been. My energy came in small pockets, like sunlight through slats. The bills came in big paper stacks. Insurance paid some things, but left gaps. I got calls from the hospital about follow-ups, and from work about coverage for my students. Old routines faltered. New ones formed around driving to dialysis centers and sleeping more. It wasn't until I sat at Tanya's kitchen table with my laptop open, scanning through our online statements, that the quiet arithmetic of betrayal began to reveal itself. At first it was small, a withdrawal here, a charge there, then a pattern, then documentation that had no business existing in my life. There were credit cards opened in my name that I'd never signed for. The joint account, the one I'd balanced every month, the ledger I turned into a kind of intimate diary, had been emptied in a way that felt personal, as if someone had decided they needed to remove me from the picture, and started by stripping the financial scaffolding away. A second mortgage, supposedly taken out to help with medical bills, bore a signature in my handwriting that I had not made. When I compared the strokes, the loop of the Y, the way the R dipped, there was an uncanny mimicry, an attempt at me that missed the small idiosyncrasies, like stealing someone's laugh and imitating it with the wrong pitch. The life insurance policy was a colder kind of punctuation. I called the agent because I needed to understand who would pay for what in the event of death, a practical, dark inversion of the kindness I'd just shown. On the page, in the margins of a small font contract, there was a date that sat like a tiny, accusing fingerprint. The policy had been issued before Gloria's diagnosis. Ryan was the beneficiary. I felt the room spin in that silent, slow way that makes you aware of tiles and light fixtures as if they've betrayed you.
This was not something that grew out of illness. This was premeditated in a way that library books and quiet promises could not cover. Taken together, drained accounts, new cards, a mortgage with a forged signature, a beneficiary designation written before the first kidney tests, the paper trail began to outline a plan. The plan used family language and the language of care as camouflage. The plan had been in motion for months, possibly years. I didn't shout. I sat, hands tight around a mug of coffee that had gone cold. Tanya took one look at my face and sat down across from me without asking a question. She had been there for every part of this in a practical way, bringing soup after surgery, arguing with insurance companies, driving me to follow-ups at odd hours. She held out a pile of documents she had printed from our joint accounts when I asked her to, and a pen. Her expression was the look of someone who is both furious and frightened for you. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, not because she didn't know, but because questions are the shape of a plan. I had done the giving. Now I had to do something to recover. The bank's phone system put me on hold for what felt like an eternity as a recorded voice promised me security. Somebody at the bank eventually guided me to freeze accounts, to change passwords, to request fraud reports. Freezing an account is not the same as undoing the past. The freeze was a bandage, but the cut was still there. Friends and colleagues rallied in ways that were both practical and quietly affirming. Dr. Helen called more than once, in short breaths of concern, and she sent me a list of substitutes covering my classes. Students, Jada and others, sent cards and small painted tiles with hopeful phrases that read like talismans. The pottery room became a refuge. The clay loved hands at all stages of mending. When I sat and shaped a bowl, the motion was both metaphor and medicine. But the documents were an entirely different current. I took out a folder and began to assemble what I had. The mortgage paperwork, the credit card statements, the life insurance page with its date stamped like a small red truth, the forged signature that matched my own in the crude way of something copied from a photocopy. Each document was like a chapter heading in a book I never wanted to write. Each page told me, with ink and not apology, that my generosity had been measured, cataloged, and used. At night, I would wake thinking of the operating room, the cold scalpel, the way a nurse had told me to breathe with her. Waking my body to betrayal felt like a new kind of pain. There is a shame that follows exploitation, a private accusation that says you should have noticed, you should have stopped him, you should have seen the signs. I rejected that shame like an old coat. It would not fit. I knew the small signs had been there, the withdrawals, the secrecy, but so had my trust, which was not an error to be punished. I had believed in family. I had believed in saving a life. That belief was not a flaw. There were other messages, more mundane, that later gained weight. Doctor's notes that showed a hurried follow-up appointment that Gloria had called to change at the last minute. A voicemail from Ryan that sounded dully rehearsed. A text thread that showed planning for a celebration the week after the operation that read to them as reward and to me as a sale completed. It was like watching a time-lapse while a friendly garden was slowly being paved over while I slept.
My sister reminded me I wasn't alone in the world, even when the people who should have shown up had left. Tanya organized meals, filed complaints with the credit bureaus, drove me to the bank. She also scolded me like a mother in small, precise ways that I didn't know I needed, and made sure I had enough iron-rich soup to keep my level steady. Her practical anger fueled an ember in me that I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't the bright flame of immediate retribution. It was the steady heat of something that would burn for a long time. A resolve to make sure this wasn't just a private hole I fell into. I wanted to name what had been done. I started to keep a list. A legal book has a different rhythm than a diary, but I kept both. The list in my head grew, a ledger of harms and potential evidence. Life insurance taken out before diagnosis, credit cards opened and used, a second mortgage with my signature forged, text messages that hinted at plans, the divorce papers like a stamp. These were not just betrayals of trust. They were acts that had financial consequences I would have to live with for years. It felt like the line between what had been mine and what had been planned for me had been deliberately blurred, and that blurring was both cruel and cleverly executed. At the same time, there was an undercurrent I couldn't resolve. There had been mentions at the hospital of how my match with Gloria had been unusually precise. The surgeons had said good match in a way that stuck in my head. But these were technical, scientific phrases that, in the slow dawn after betrayal, took on new meaning. HLA compatibility is a detail that most people don't think about until they are in a room with a medical chart and a doctor's patient face. It's a list of markers that tell an immune system whether a kidney is friend or foe. I had always understood it as a kind of good luck. Now it felt like a variable someone might have considered when plotting a plan. The realization of a plan moves in stages. First, there is shock, then a scraping of details. Then a pattern emerges like constellations you can only see once you step back. I started to see the dots join. The policy dated before diagnosis, the quiet withdrawal of funds, the divorce papers, and the most chilling part, the language of permanence used by Ryan and the family long before I had been told I was a good match.
It reframed their kindness as calculation. When I called the hospital to request copies of my medical records, the nurse who put me on hold came back apologetic and referred me to the medical records department. A week later, I sat in the hospital medical records office while a clerk printed out typed pages and prescriptions and typed lab results. I found the HLA typing sheets, the typed notes that said excellent match, the consent forms I had signed. The records also noted a line about family testing in the same file, a terse note that the family had been counseled. There was no hint of malice in the way the clinic had handled me, only a mirror of the professional tasks they were required to perform. But to me, the clinical notes were another piece of the map that pointed at a plan. I remember the feeling as a slow stacking of facts that made the floor wobble. Each new page was a plank laid across old misunderstandings. I could see how someone with intent might have quietly assembled these pieces, the right phrase here, the right beneficiary designation there, while I was doing the only thing I had always thought of as noble. I started talking to people. I called a woman who had once been in legal aid in another town and asked for advice. She breathed and said she couldn't tell me what to do over the phone, but to collect documents and talk to someone who could look at them. I reached out to an old friend from college who worked in forensic accounting. She sent a message back asking if I had anything that looked like coordinated withdrawals or transfers. The answer was yes. The more I spoke to people, the more the list grew. But for all the practical guidance, there was a person in me who still had to reconcile this. I had given a kidney. I had done it to save someone. In exchange, I had been erased from a life I helped build. At first, there was a desire to pronounce verdicts, to brand people for what they had done. Then there was anger, large and hot. But then another feeling settled in, a wary focus. If this was a plan, it had left tracks. If it was exploitation, it had left evidence. A life insurance policy with a date that contradicted illness is a timestamp. A forged signature is a crime. An emptied account is a ledger of movement. Papers are the bones of a plan. Tanya would not let me wallow in righteous fury alone. She would say, in that voice parents use when trying to steer a teenager into safer choices, "Okay, we gather, we freeze, we make lists. Then we talk to somebody with authority." Gathering felt like work, and it was work I could control. It was a place to pour energy into something that would not fade with sleep. The act of compilation, arranging photocopies, marking dates, highlighting beneficiary fields, became my tether. Before long, the shape of the next step was obvious, even if the steps themselves weren't yet clear. Talk to a lawyer who could read the pattern. But even thinking about a lawyer had its hurdles.
Money for representation, the timing, the emotional labor of telling the story again and again to strangers who would take notes. It felt surreally intimate to hand over the evidence of your life to a legal process, and yet that process was, possibly, the instrument that would let the facts be respected in the way they deserved. I found myself thinking of the students who had given me small painted tiles. They had drawn birds and suns and little hands holding one another. Their small works felt like proof that people can build beauty from pieces. If my life had been broken into pages and signatures, I wanted to stitch those pages into a narrative that would be about agency rather than exploitation. I wanted my choice and the betrayal to be recorded, not erased. In the quiet moments, I allowed myself to imagine a different end, one where restitution was a letter on a desk, one where a courtroom made everything clear. That is a fantasy, the kind that helps endurance but rarely maps accurately to process. Real life is more complicated than a closing argument. Legal processes take time. Evidence must be collected, reviewed, and sometimes reinterpreted. People who have been hurt must learn to live again while they wait. But there was a resourcefulness in me that had not been there before the papers appeared on the bedside cart. Maybe it had always been there. Maybe it had been dormant under my habit of believing the best in people. Either way, it was awake now. The next morning, after a night where sleep came only in small, stolen breaths, I put the dog-eared folder in my bag and made my way to a small coffee shop with warm light and a barista who knew my order. I needed to breathe in the world a little differently, to place documents between sips of coffee and feel the letters against my palm. The shop smelled of sugar and roasted beans, the kind of ordinary that steadies you when all else is off kilter. I sat, opened the folder, and started to write a chronology. When he called that afternoon, I let it ring. I watched the number appear on the screen and then go to voicemail. The message he left was brief and familiar in the way men can make distance sound like politeness. "Maya, we need to talk. Call me when you're up to it." It was the same voice that had said, "We need to take care of this as a family." It sounded small and rehearsed. I listened and felt a wind of something. Contempt, cowardice, both, brushed past me. I had been the one to give something vital. The irony did not escape me. I had chosen to say yes to a surgery while also signing my name to forms and answering questions, always with the hope that it would save someone else. But choice is complicated when accompanied by manipulation. It is not always a sharp coercion. Sometimes it is the slow tilt of expectation that builds until saying no feels like treason against compassion.
That is the trap they set without building a lock, to make altruism a debt you never consented to owe. That evening, I sat with the chronology and the documents until the coffee shop light dimmed. I copied the life insurance page into my phone, took a photo of the mortgage paperwork, scanned the forged signature. My hands shook at times. At other times, they were steady as a craftsman's. There is a strange clarity that comes with assembling evidence. It is a kind of ownership you reclaim over the narrative of your life. I didn't know then how to proceed to the end of this story. I only knew this. I would not let the divorce papers be the final punctuation. I would not let the text that called me temporary define me. There were people who could help make the paper trail speak, and there were friends who would help me stand as I learned to walk again. I had given something of myself. Now I had to keep the rest. As the evening closed, I sent a single email, measured, factual, to a contact a friend had recommended at a legal aid clinic. I attached copies of the creditor statements and the mortgage papers. I wrote a short note. I need help. I was careful with my words. The documents would do the rest. In the dark, the house that belonged to Tanya creaked in ways that were familiar, and I slept in that sleep which isn't peace exactly, but a pause. The exhaustion of surgery mixed with the new strain of betrayal left me fragile and adamant at once. Dawn came with the familiar light of an ordinary world, and with it an uneasy expectation. Something was coming that would not be about me giving anymore. It would be about me choosing again, choosing how to respond, who to trust, and how to shape the life that had a hole where a kidney had once been, but that also, stubbornly, still belonged to me. The email is sent before the sun fully warms the windowsill. I wait by the phone like someone expecting an argument, which feels absurd. I don't want to argue. I want someone with a professional vocabulary to tell me whether my paper trail reads like coincidence or like intent. The phone rings in the coffee shop just as I am folding the chronology into the back pocket of my notebook. Marcus Webb's voice is flat and quick and somehow full of the kind of patience that says he has listened to worse and knows the next steps anyway.
He says he's with legal aid and that they do intake on Wednesdays and he can meet me tomorrow. He asked me to bring everything. He asked the question that puts the entire morning into a new frame. Do you feel safe to come in? The question is small and precise, and I hear in it 1,000 other people asking other small, precise things. I say yes and mean it. Marcus is 50 maybe, with a softness around the eyes that doesn't hide the fact that he's used courtroom hours like a weight training for the soul. He sits with his hands folded and listens while I spread the mortgage page and the life insurance policy and the bank statements like a slow reveal. When I mention Gloria's beneficiary date, he runs his thumb along the page like he's checking the grain of wood. If that date precedes any medical diagnosis, he says, it speaks to premeditation. He does not promise outcomes. He says things that calm me. We'll subpoena records. We'll talk to the trustee. We can look at claims for fraud and coercion. That language is precise and limited in the way a map is limited. It shows roads, not the weather you'll find on them. There is a moment when Marcus looks up and says softly, "There are reasons I take cases like this." He doesn't elaborate at first. Later, outside the meeting room, he tells me his wife died several years prior, and he spent the months after her death building a practice around helping people whose lives had been turned inside out. He mentions the cause only to frame a habit. He cannot be sure of everything, but he believes strongly that procedural justice matters for people who have been left without the power to argue for themselves. He mentions it quietly, not to solicit pity, but to explain why he has the time and why he moves quickly. He asks if I can bring everything to a formal intake meeting, and if I can allow legal aid to request bank records and hospital files. He asks if I'm comfortable with forensic accounting being brought in. I say yes. He says good. We'll start there. The trustee arrives into the picture like a new character in a long bad book. Linda Morales is methodical and brisk and wears her skepticism like a badge. She is a bankruptcy trustee assigned to cases where irregularities are suspected. She has handled closed files and reopened wrongs before. When I first meet her, she is all business and a small, tight smile that does not waste itself on false consolation. She says right away that signatures can be compared, that banks keep time-stamped logs, that life insurance companies file everything with dates they cannot take back. When I show her the mortgage paperwork with my signature photocopied and the life insurance page, she nods with an exactness that means she knows what to do and how to make paper speak. This is the part of the work that feels like excavation. It's dusty and slow and requires patience you get only by doing 1,000 small things correctly. Marcus files subpoenas for bank statements, for beneficiary paperwork, for emails and text logs. Linda calls the mortgage servicer and asks for the origination packet. She requests the loan application and the copies of IDs that were used. The bank replies with the bland, bureaucratic letters of the modern age, and Linda reads them with a face that apologizes for the delay, but not the facts. Meanwhile, a name I had not expected appears on my phone. It's Cassie. She texts first. "Maya, I don't know how to say this. Can we meet?" I am sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of tea that has gone cold, and the folder open in front of me. I feel like the folder has become both a shield and a wound. I agree to meet at the public library because it is neutral, because it's between both worlds. Cassie is younger than I expected, with a voice that cracks occasionally when she speaks my name. She comes with a small envelope, and when she slides into the bench, she looks like someone both rehearsed and apologetic. She says she doesn't want to be complicit, and she doesn't, but she is also scared of Ryan, of what might happen if she speaks, of losing the fragile security a new relationship promises when you're pregnant and waiting for the world to rearrange itself. She hands me a USB drive. "I found this on his computer," she says, and then quickly, "I didn't steal anything, I swear. I found it." On it are screenshots of texts, spreadsheets with names and numbers, a list that names donors and highlights compatibility scores. There are messages from Gloria about celebrating after the transplant, even before the testing. There are texts from Ryan to Gloria that read like project management, timelines, budgets, notes about beneficiary set and close estate transfer. There is a calendar entry, weeks earlier, to review policy options. The USB drive feels like the last piece of the map. Cassie's evidence complicates the story of betrayal into one that reads like planning. She sits there and cries quietly about how she thought she was helping him, how she thought he was going to leave the old life and build something new with her and their baby. She shows me a text where Ryan refers to me as the donor in a way that makes my chest sting. She didn't want this. She didn't give the papers to me. She handed them to Marcus. She tells the truth a slow, frightened way that makes her a witness and not a villain. Marcus reads the messages slowly and says, "This is more than hearsay." He requests forensic copies of the files and sends them to the accountant. He arranges for a forensic IT consultant to make images of Ryan's cloud storage and to preserve metadata that can be subpoenaed. There's a small dramatic relief in knowing these digital footprints can be preserved. Digital records are stubborn. They do not forget in the ways people do. The forensic accountant becomes a new, unsettling collaborator. She spends days hunched over spreadsheets, comparing transfers, following money the way an archaeologist follows a river toward the sea. She produces a timeline. Money moved one account to another, checks written to cash, account strained the day after the divorce papers were served, a second mortgage initiated with a loan officer who says the application came by fax at an odd hour. The forensic report is detailed and clinical. It points to coordinated movement and to signatures that do not match mine.
Linda uses it to justify moving to void the forged mortgage, and to seek immediate injunctive relief on certain accounts. There are small victories along this narrow road. The bank freezes certain transfers. The mortgage servicer admits the signature block doesn't match and opens an internal review. The life insurance company places a hold on claims while it investigates beneficiary designation and dates. None of these feel like grand justice. They feel like paper being rerouted away from someone else's grasp. But each small move is a blade cutting through the web. The criminal investigation begins to coalesce. A detective calls me at home and asks the same list of questions a dozen different people have asked: dates, receipts, messages. He is careful and not dramatic, and tells me he has been assigned because the state's attorney's office is interested in the potential for fraud and forgery. He can't guarantee an arrest today or tomorrow, but he asks me to be patient, to let the process do what it does, and to be present for interviews. Being present feels like weightlifting for the soul. It drains you, but makes you stronger in ways you do not expect. One evening, 2 months in, I receive a letter that is small in size and large in consequence. Formal charges have been filed against Ryan: forgery, theft, conspiracy. Gloria is named as a co-conspirator in certain counts. The life insurance company was listed as the affected party in an allegation of misrepresentation. The legal language is precise and cold. I read it in the pottery room, with clay under my nails and students moving about the room like a chorus. It is both strange and not that strange to read legal paper among cups at the center table. The filing does not erase what happened. It does make a statement that the state will look into actions that used law-like instruments to hide moral crimes. There are complicating humanities. Cassie later tells me she is leaving Ryan. She is terrified and protective of her child and says she wants nothing to do with someone who would plan documents to profit on another human life. She provides sworn statements to the detective and hands over more messages. Her involvement is messy and brave. She is both a victim of manipulation and a witness. Gloria's reaction is difficult to predict. She insists to some people that she loved me and that the transplant saved her life. She alternates between apology and denial in conversations recorded for the investigators. There is a complexity to her situation: aging, fear of dying, the complicated loyalties within a family. That complexity does not make her actions less harmful when they are shown to be coordinated to leverage my generosity for gain, but it does make the human cost heavier. The hospital performs its own internal review. They look at the counseling sessions and the consent forms and the notes from the social workers. They find no procedural violation on the hospital side. They had followed the accepted protocols for voluntary living donation. They had counseled me, and they had confirmed my informed consent. That review is both a relief and a disappointment. Relief because it doesn't suggest the hospital colluded. Disappointment because it raises the question of how a careful process can still produce exploitation without any single professional being culpable. The hospital administrators say they will look into whether there are policy changes they can make about family testing and counseling. I sit with that paradox and find it is not a contradiction, but a gap. Institutions can follow their boxes and still be outflanked by human plans. That gap is the one Marcus wants to fill with law and with testimony, and with a clearer definition of coercion in living donation cases. He talks about reforms. He talks about how donors sometimes need additional protections when family dynamics and financial incentives are at play. He is careful in his language, so nothing reads like policy advocacy without data, but his conviction ripples in the way he lays out potential briefs for the state's attorney. There are hard nights. Some nights I wake thinking of how a body accepts an organ and holds gratitude, and in my case, how that gratitude was converted into paperwork. There are also nights when I dream of a courtroom where signatures float like evidence in an old film, and an audience that watches with the steady curiosity of a jury. The reality is slower: depositions, scheduling conflicts, co-defendant motions, and continuances. The state moves methodically. My days acquire a new rhythm: teaching,
pottery, meetings with Marcus, phone calls with Linda, emails about status hearings. The worst calls are the ones where Ryan tries to bargain. He calls once from a jail-era visiting room phone, his voice a rough, pleading thing. "We can make this right," he says, as if rights can be bartered. He asks me to meet him to talk about forgiveness, and then later in the same month, phones to say that Gloria's health is worse, and asks whether I'd consider being evaluated again as a donor for her other kidney. He says it as if anyone can take an organ like a loan and repay it, as if human flesh and life can be reissued on command. There was a clarity in my refusal that I had not had in that hospital room. At the legal clinic, Marcus drafts a refusal of donation affidavit for me to sign. It is a small piece of paper that I carry in my wallet like armor, a formal statement declaring that I will not consent to any future transplantation-related procedures for Gloria or anyone connected to the scheme without independent counseling and legal oversight. I sign it in front of a notary because the weight of my body has more to do with documentation now than I'd ever imagined. The piece of paper is not vengeance. It is a boundary.
It is a way to say, I gave once because I chose to save a life. I will not be coerced into being a resource again. People respond to boundaries in different ways. Ryan becomes bitter and then silent. Cassie's contact in court is testimony. She says she finally understood the extent of a plan when she saw the spreadsheets. Gloria seeks distance and then returns to the hospital for dialysis and clinic visits. She is, in a way, a victim of her own choices and the choices of others around her. I do not condone what she did. I also feel the ache that comes when someone clings to life the way a drowning person clutches a float. The trustees' motions begin to make the finances shift. Linda files a motion to void the forged mortgage and to recoup some of the funds taken from our joint account. There's a hearing where a bank lawyer mutters terms like good faith borrower and record retention. Linda counters with signature analysis and a stack of emails. The hearing room smells like brewed coffee and recycled air. I sit in the gallery and watch a lawyer in a suit move paper around while the judge asks exactly 3 questions that matter. The judge agrees there is probable cause to unwind certain transactions and sets a schedule for recovery. It is not poetic. It is a mechanical justice. It is, in its mechanical way, a small restoration. Then, and this is a line I had not expected to be a relief, my bankruptcy is discharged. The word discharged lands on the page like a bell that rings and then fades. It does not change the emotional ledger, but it clears certain legal obstacles. My name is not legally responsible for debts thrust upon me by forged documents. My credit will take time to heal, but the immediate choking weight that came from the threats of eviction and debt collectors loosens. I cry in the pottery room that night, hands in clay, and the students look at me like I have made some new work. The tears are both grief and release. News outlets begin to call. Someone from a local paper has seen court filings and asks if I will speak. I am cautious and say yes on the condition that certain details be redacted. I don't want my physical medical records splashed across headlines. Marcus advises restraint while acknowledging that public attention can be a lever for change. We agree to a careful, measured interview that highlights the exploitative pattern without sensationalizing the people involved. The public response is complicated and human. Messages come from strangers. Some tell similar stories. Some offer legal tips or angry curses. My inbox is a mosaic of armchairs and civility and rage. Jada, the student who paints birds, brings a card with a line that says, "You painted for us when we could not." Anonymous donors send a little money to cover a therapy session. Dr. Helen organizes a substitute for when my schedule gets eaten by court and makes sure my students are taken care of. I begin to rebuild the pottery program with the same careful attention I once gave to stacking cups. The program becomes a place for conversation about boundaries, about consent, about being used, and about refusing use. We run a small series of community classes about self-care and financial literacy, partnering with local legal aid volunteers. Marcus joins for one session and speaks in simple terms about red flags, sudden financial secrecy, beneficiary changes about discussion, pressure mixed with affection. He clarifies that only a lawyer can advise in a specific case, but he offers general knowledge to a room that nods and takes notes. The blog starts as a defensive gesture. I title it The Cost of Giving because it is specific and not sentimental. I write about the mechanics of my case in plain language and about the emotional calculus of choosing to donate. I do not give medical advice. I write about what it feels like to make an anatomical gift for it. I publish redacted copies of the life insurance page and of the forensic report, not to shame, but to illuminate how these schemes hide behind ordinary wording. The blog attracts readers who have been through similar things, and I begin to hear threads of a broader pattern, people whose acts of charity have been monetized by those closest to them. Marcus and I start running legal clinics once a month in the community center.
We sit with people who arrive with small stacks of paper and big questions. We cannot to freeze accounts, how to preserve evidence, and when to call the authorities. We speak about the ethical obligations of clinicians in living donation situations, about how additional counseling and independent evaluation can make a difference. The room is full of people who are relieved to see that others attend to this niche of harm. The work gives my days shape again. At the same time, the criminal case continues through its slow machinery. There are pretrial hearings and motions and the inevitable delays. Ryan pleads not guilty to several counts. We await trial dates. I learn to live in those waiting rooms. Linda continues to work tenaciously to unwind the fraudulent mortgage and to implement garnishments where allowed. Some funds are recovered, slowly. They go toward back rent and toward paying off vendors who had no idea they were being paid from fraudulent lines. None of it restores the sense of trust I had once thought unbreakable, but it creates a basis for forward movement. There is a moment, months into the process, when I sit in the registry office at the university hospital and sign paperwork to include my HLA profile in a formal, redacted registry designed to help researchers and to prevent the misuse of superdonor language in private hands. The registry is a quiet victory. It ensures that my genetic markers are part of a resource that can be used ethically, not hoarded as leverage. I sit in a small room with a hospital administrator who tells me, without flourish, that some policies are changing. Additional counseling for living donors, extra attention when family dynamics are financially complicated. It is not enough to fix what happened to me, but it feels like the institutional version of "I'm sorry" that translates into policy. The pottery room fills, slowly, with new projects that are not merely therapeutic but civic. We build a series of bowls that students triddle boundaries. Each bowl has a small line inscribed on the rim, a soft phrase about ownership of one's body and finances. People come to the studio on donation days, bearing casseroles and stories. Tanya returns to town for weekends and sells a few of my pieces at a local market to help cover legal expenses. Dr. Helen helps me secure a small grant so that the program can offer free classes to people recovering from medical procedures. My voice shifts in public. Where once I spoke in a whisper about personal hurt, now I find the words to explain the difference between altruism and coercion. I talk about consent as a living, revisitable thing, about how the simplest phrase, "family does this," should never be allowed to override counsel or financial transparency. I do not accuse large institutions of malice. I point to the ways personal greed can disguise itself in family language, and how law can be a blunt but sometimes necessary tool to make truth legible. I am marked by what happened, of course. Some days I still feel the ache of the incision when I stoop too quickly, but the anger that once simmered in my chest becomes a kind of fuel. I channel it into teaching and into small civic steps. I meet other donors, a man who donated to a neighbor, a woman who gave to a stranger through a registry, and we talk about what protections we wish had existed. Those conversations are not merely commiseration, they are seeds. They are the soil for the advocacy work that will, I hope, prevent what happened to me from happening to others. The criminal case moves forward. There is a hearing, not a sensational trial, but a hearing where lists of evidence are presented and where attorneys haggle over admissibility. I sit and watch as the legal story is told in a language of timetables and logs. Marcus reads from the spreadsheet Cassie found. The forensic accountant explains the flow of funds. It is, in a way, a relief to see my life reduced to a sequence that others can look at objectively. The judge hears arguments about intent, about whether certain transactions were made in good faith, about whether Gloria knew the extent of scheduling and beneficiary changes. I do not know how it will end. Marcus never promises certainty. He promises advocacy and unrelenting attention to detail. Somewhere in the middle of one winter, when the mornings are short, the life insurance company issues a formal decision to deny certain claims while maintaining an open investigation into beneficiary misrepresentation. That decision is not satisfaction. It is protocol. There are people who will be hurt no matter which way this goes. But there is also accountability, slowly being drawn, as if with a pencil. Lines that connect names to actions. The months that follow are not an arc of neat closure. There are setbacks and procedural annoyances and court dates postponed for reasons no one can predict. There are also moments of grace that are small and human. Cassie brings me a jar of baby food for the studio fridge. A student organizes a bake sale that pays for my parking tickets at court. Tanya lets me crash on her sofa when a hearing stretches late into the afternoon. At a community meeting Marcus and I host, a woman raises her hand and says, "What do you say to someone who is being asked to donate right now?" Marcus answers with care and suggests legal consultation if anything feels off.
He urges independent counseling. He stresses keeping copies of everything. I add my voice and say simply, "You don't owe family your organs. You owe them honesty. If it doesn't feel voluntary, it isn't." I say it with the kind of firmness that has hardened in me over months. Not brittle, not angry, resolute. We keep records of wins. The trustee recovers some funds. The mortgage has unwound in part. My bankruptcy discharged. Ryan's case moves toward trial with charges pending, and the public record reflects the gravity of the allegations, without eulogizing them. Gloria continues dialysis, a complicated patient within a complicated story. Cassie has a baby and names her in a way that feels like forgiveness. Not for Ryan, but for the possibility of a life that can belong to no one but the child. The pottery program grows into something that sustains me financially and ethically. We launch a small scholarship for students who cannot afford supplies and host panels about consent and exploitation. My blog is read by people in other cities who email to say they were saved from something similar by knowing there were red flags. A suburban law professor reaches out about a case study. A local nonprofit asks me to speak at a fundraiser. The work expands beyond me, which is precisely what I had hoped would happen. In quieter moments, I still hold the folder. I look at the divorce papers that once felt like a blade and see them now as a rupture that allowed me to step away from definitions that were not mine. The memory of the hospital room, the monitor beeps, the fluorescent light, is tethered to both loss and a strange, resilient pride. I did something radical. I gave away a piece of myself in an act born of compassion. I did not imagine that compassion could be counted as currency by people I trusted. But in the aftermath, I reclaimed my narrative.
If there is a lesson I want to leave with anyone listening, it is this. Gifts are not liabilities to be exploited. When you give, you do not sign away the rest of your life. Boundaries are not betrayals. They are instruments of survival. I teach my students to make bowls with lips that hold soup and voices that hold memory. I teach them that clay, once deformed, can be reformed, and that sometimes a new shape is better suited to what will come next. Months from the hospital bed, years in the slow accounting of court filings and spreadsheets, the title line of my life no longer reads only as an accusation. It is a fact of a moment, precise and painful, but it is not the whole of my story. I gave a kidney to save my mother-in-law and got divorce papers in return. That sentence still lands like a stone in a pond, but now the ripples have become something else. A community that rallies to learn, a legal process that counts signatures and dates, a pottery table where hands mend and make. The theft of trust did not erase my choice to give. It sharpened it into something I now use to teach others about what consent should look like, about how to watch for the paper trails that hide in family language, and about how to keep your life, your body, your finances, your dignity, from being used as someone else's plan. If this story mattered to you, subscribe for more survivor stories and visit the resource link in the description to find legal and counseling help in your area.